The Prime Minister of Nepal has resigned as deadly protests continue across the country.
Conservative commentator Charlie Kirk has been shot and killed while speaking at a university in Utah.
The Israeli military has carried out airstrikes on Hamas leadership here in Qatar.
This is quite a bizarre phenomenon that comes specifically out of the United States. The rest of the developed world doesn't behave like this.
Mama, take this badge off of me. I can't use it anymore.
Against our freedom of speech, and they want to control us just like a dictator.
Getting dark, too dark to see.
A brazen attempt by the U.S. government to spy on North Korea.
The United States has sunk a boat after it left Venezuela carrying drugs.
Mama put my guns in the ground.
Polish and NATO forces scrambled to shoot down Russian drones that violated its airspace.
Anti-immigration is our key political issue.
Are you racist?
Yeah, we're racist.
That long black cloud is coming down.
The former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, has been sentenced to more than 27 years in jail for trying to orchestrate a coup after he lost the 2022 election.
Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door.
This is our country! You should be here standing with us!
Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door.
We have a huge amount to cover this month, and the first stop on our globe-trotting journey is Brazil. September saw the Supreme Court of Brazil sentence former President Jair Bolsonaro to more than 27 years in prison for plotting a military coup. The investigation into the coup was kicked off shortly after the nation's 2022 election, which saw Jair Bolsonaro narrowly lose to two-time President Lula da Silva. Bolsonaro and his allies would go on to spread false allegations of electoral fraud, which would ultimately culminate in the 2022 January 8 Brasilia incident. In a scene that would closely mirror America's own January 6th incident a year before, supporters of Bolsonaro would forcibly enter the Supreme Federal Court and the National Congress Palace in an attempt to overturn the election. Although 80 people were injured and over 2,000 were detained, there were fortunately no fatalities from the incident. Bolsonaro himself wasn't even in the country during the raid, as only a few days before, he was photographed eating chicken in a Florida KFC. Fast forward to February 2024, and Bolsonaro was ordered to hand over his passport after being declared a flight risk. Later that month, he would be seen spending 2 nights inside Brasilia's Hungarian embassy. Investigators suspected that he had been planning to claim asylum with the help of Viktor Orban, a fellow far-right politician and personal friend of Bolsonaro. A year later, in February 2025, Bolsonaro and 33 others were formally charged with plotting to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, as well as current Brazilian President Lula da Silva. The round of sentencing this month marks the first time in Brazil's 140-year history that military officials have been punished for attempting to overthrow democracy. During the announcement, Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes stated, quote, "He tried to annihilate the essential pillars of the democratic rule of law state, the greatest consequence of which would have been the return of dictatorship to Brazil." Considering this was the guy Bolsonaro plotted to have killed, that's a pretty tame response. Although many within Brazil celebrated the sentencing as a huge win for democratic systems, pro-Bolsonaro protesters were quick to condemn the court's decision. Some have been particularly critical of Brazil's judiciary, stating that it's been particularly harsh in prosecuting those involved in the January 8th incident. One Bolsonaro supporter was initially given 14 years in prison for vandalizing a statue with lipstick, a sentence which was later turned into house arrest. President Trump, who had previously called Bolsonaro's trial a witch hunt, had this to say shortly after the sentence was handed down.
Well, I watched that trial. I know him pretty well. Foreign leader. I thought he was a good president of Brazil, and it's very surprising that that could happen. That's very much like they tried to do with me, but they didn't get away with it at all. But I can only say this. I knew him as president of Brazil. He was a good man. and I don't see that happening.
Only this July, the Trump administration announced targeted sanctions against Judge Moraes, accusing him of arbitrary pretrial detentions and suppressing freedom of expression. Alexandre de Moraes has gained a pretty stern reputation within Brazil for his hardline approach against those who spread fake news. He was the one behind Brazil's temporary blackout of Twitter in October last year, following the reinstatement of accounts associated with the January 8th incident. To put it simply, Moraes is the kind of guy who puts democracy over freedom of expression. And although he operates entirely within Brazilian law, he really doesn't fuck around when it comes to upholding democratic institutions. We'll leave the question of whether this is the right outlook to you, the viewer. Regardless of Moraes' hardline stance, most commentators consider the US sanctions to be politically motivated. In the wider context of Brazil as a nation, the strength of democratic institutions and the involvement of the US government have only fueled Bolsonaro's detractors. Brazil's last dictatorship only ended in 1985, an authoritarian rule that was backed by the US government. Considering there's a whole generation of Brazilians who remember living under a US-backed dictatorship, the court's no-bullshit approach to an attempted coup isn't all that surprising. While some Brazilians flooded into the streets for a multi-night celebration following Jair Bolsonaro's 27-year sentence, others believe that his incarceration will further rally his supporters to continue his movement. The next Brazilian election is scheduled for a year from now, so we'll likely be looping back to this story in the not-too-distant future. Viewers who are looking to escape their own dictatorships may be interested in today's sponsor. We've done around 1 million Surfshark ads over the years, so this time we're going to be doing something a little different. Here's how to disable ads on YouTube, sponsored by Surfshark VPN. The first method is to use Surfshark's Clean Web feature. You probably know that this blocks trackers, malware, and phishing attempts, but it can also be used to nuke ads, specifically by using Surfshark's Clean Web 2.0 browser extension. You can make YouTube's ads a thing of the past. The second method is to simply change your location to a place where YouTube doesn't serve ads. YouTube actually has a full list of specific countries where they show ads, and it may surprise you to know that most nations aren't on that list. Lucky for you, Surfshark has 100 different countries to choose from. By connecting to a country like Albania, Moldova, or Monaco, you don't even need an ad blocker, because YouTube won't even attempt to give you ads in the first place. Don't feel guilty about ad blocking our channel either. With the sheer amount of demonetized videos and copyright claims we deal with, our monthly ad revenue barely covers the cost of our thumbnails. If you've been a long-time viewer of this channel, you'll know that we get to keep making the news because of Surfshark, and in spite of YouTube. To get started, just go to surfshark.com/surswag. Use the code SURSWAG or scan this QR code, and you'll score yourself an extra 4 months on the house. The best part is if you're not completely satisfied with Surfshark, you can just back out within the first 30 days and get a full refund. Surfshark VPN. It's cheaper than YouTube Premium. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of Health announces that Tylenol causes autism. Afghan women are left under earthquake rubble as touching male rescue workers is forbidden, and America's domestic school shooting industry is now worth $4 billion. About a year has passed since we covered France's snap election fiasco back in July of 2024, and it seems as though the country is still stun-locked by routine government collapses. On September 9th, French Prime Minister François Bayrou formally resigned after lawmakers sternly shot down his government's plan to tame France's growing debt. At the beginning of September, France's deficit was that of 198 billion euros, which was roughly 6% of their national gross domestic product. The European Union demanded that number be cut down to below 3%, meaning that 40 billion needed to be saved. Prime Minister Bayrou's plan to do so involved freezing welfare within France, slashing away at civil service jobs, and doing away with 2 public holidays, that being Easter Monday and May 8th, a day that commemorates the end of World War II in Europe. It is an understatement to say that no one liked that. Parliament's vote was 364 to 194 against the plan. And before lawmakers even voted themselves, Bayrou was hosting a farewell drink to his career as Prime Minister after only 9 months in office. France is now onto its 4th Prime Minister in a span of under 2 years, with the new Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu taking up the mantle. Needless to say, France's government remains unfunctional. But how did we end up here? For those that need a refresher, back in August of 2024, we reported on Emmanuel Macron's snap election. And that story resulted in Macron's centrist bloc losing power and France's parliament being split into 3 rival blocs known as the far left, the centrists, and the far right, none of which commands a majority within parliament still to this day. Because of the lack of majority seating, France's parliament has been unable to vote properly, effectively achieving nothing within the past year. In addition to that, President Macron has repeatedly invoked Article 49.3 to push legislation without a vote, completely superseding the ungovernable parliament he worked to create. The perfect storm of events has led to France becoming a government only capable of collapse. With this in mind, France is still the 2nd largest country within the European Union, meaning that instability within the country has no doubt affected their allied nations. In order for France to maintain its own steady existence going into the future, the government must pull together and provide a solution. Though what that would be like at this time is most uncertain. As of the time of writing, French citizens have been revolting in the streets and are probably still revolting in the streets, like the French so commonly do when anything of note happens in the country. The movement known as Block Everything has gained major traction ever since September 9th, with protesters blocking major junctions, highways, city centres, and fuel depots to get their message across. And that message is that the working class will not assume the burden of France's debt above wealthy billionaires and corporations, especially under a dysfunctional government. The next stop on our protest world tour is Indonesia, which saw a wave of demonstrations from late August spill out into the first week of September. The protests started following a proposed change to housing allowances, which would give members of parliament an extra 50 million rupiah, around $3,000 a month. The proposal highlighted the extreme level of income inequality within Indonesia, at a time when most citizens have been facing wage stagnation and a rising cost of living. Despite Jakarta having one of the highest minimum wages in the country, the $3,000 housing allowances represent a figure 10 times this number, and this isn't considering their regular salaries, which are significantly higher. Although protests initially started at a university in Jakarta, demonstrations quickly spread much further, attracting both students and labor unions. Protesters' demands included ending outsourcing, raising minimum wages, halting mass layoffs, and reforming labor taxes. The movement was subsequently supercharged on the 28th of August, when an armoured vehicle used by law enforcement struck and killed 21-year-old motorcycle taxi driver Afan Kurniawan. While most protesters were pretty peaceful, this was a spontaneous movement born out of anger in the 4th most populous country on earth. Inevitably, it started getting violent. The homes of lawmakers were looted and ransacked, Jakarta's public transport system grinded to a halt, and the paramilitary building in Makassar was set on fire, ultimately killing 3 people. Quite an interesting trend this month was that the Straw Hat Pirate's Jolly Roger from One Piece appeared to be widely adopted as a symbol of protest. The protagonists in the anime often fight for the liberation of oppressed people, and due to its popularity worldwide, it's also been adopted by protesters in France and Nepal. Nuranti Jali, a professor of media and communications at Oklahoma State University, explains why the flag has been so widely adopted. She describes that the flag, quote, can help elevate what the people are trying to say without having to say it word for word. They're not speaking the same language, but they understand what the story is about. Among Indonesian lawmakers, the flag has invoked a series of very different responses. These ranged from viewing the flag as a democratic right of public expression, to others who want to outright ban the flag, viewing it as a symbol of treason. At time of writing, the protests resulted in at least 10 fatalities, thousands of arrests, and an estimated $53 million in damage to public infrastructure. This equates to just over 2.5 years of the housing allowance payments, had they actually been passed into law. From a purely monetary perspective, the nation's 2 weeks of unrest was still cheaper than actually paying the fucking bonuses. Since our last episode, both the UK and Australia have had some pretty sizable anti-immigration rallies, so we're throwing them together. To start with south of the equator, the August 31st March for Australia protests saw an estimated 54,000 people attend a series of rallies across 7 states and territories. The specific views of the protesters tended to vary greatly depending on who was interviewed. Some in attendance simply wanted legal migration quotas to be capped at a lower rate, while others were overt members of white nationalists groups. This was actually one of the hardest stories to write, because a primary tactic employed by neo-Nazi groups is to essentially hijack rallies in an attempt to make their own views appear mainstream. This is exactly what happened in Adelaide, when neo-Nazi attendees took control of a public mic for their own speech near the end of the rally. In this instance, the organisers simply cut the power. The rally in Melbourne appeared to have a much more overt extremist element, with white supremacist leader Thomas Sewell taking up a prominent speaking position. Meanwhile, the Sydney protest was reportedly organised by pseudonymous nationalist figure Beck Freedom. In a live stream earlier in August, Freedom would explain how to make far-right ideas more palatable to the general public. In her own words, quote, "This is how I tried to explain it to somebody. I say, okay, so protect Australian heritage, culture, way of life. Next step, protect European culture, heritage, way of life. The next step is to protect white heritage. It all means the same thing." It probably didn't help that the related March for Australia website advocated for remigration, which is a policy which calls for the mass expulsion of immigrants and their descendants. The remigration section has since been removed, but no one actually knows who made the website in the first place. An investigation by Australia's national broadcaster found no evidence that Australia's National Socialist Network had any part in organising the protests, despite their presence at the rallies. This obviously presents a problem, because as counter-protesters were quick to point out, extremist groups are able to use anti-immigration rhetoric to tap into legitimate concerns around housing and cost of living. This is where things get complicated, because cost of living in Australia, genuinely, is really fucking high. A recent report by Demographia found that out of the top 15 least affordable housing markets, Australia made up 5 of them. Just for reference, a score of 3 or under is meant to indicate an affordable housing market, while 9 and above is considered impossibly unaffordable. Then you have fucking Sydney, sitting at 13.8. On the immigration side, it's fair to say that Australia's immigration figures are also pretty damn high. Recent figures indicate that around 31.5% of Australia's population was born overseas, which is around double that of the UK or US. Economists agree that increased immigration tends to lead to upward pressure on tight housing markets. However, immigration is only a very small piece of the cost of living puzzle. Zoning laws, a labour shortage, and very favourable tax incentives for property investors contribute much more to the increase in housing prices. There's also the fact that the number of residential dwellings have risen comparative to the overall population over the past 10 years. Another important consideration is that Australia's high rate of migration is very much self-serving. Without migration, Australia's low birth rates would lead to an eventual demographic collapse, much like Japan or Italy. The country would find itself unable to reach a balanced budget, and its economy would miss out on a 2.3% bump over the next 10 years. According to Brendan Ryan, the chief economist at KPMG, even if Australia stopped all immigration immediately, it would only decrease the cost of housing by 2.3% over the next decade. That's not saying it would decrease by that much, just that it would increase 2.3% less. Considering housing prices have increased around 70% over the past 10 years, it would be hard to attribute this to immigration figures. A genuine debate around immigration does exist here, but unfortunately that tends to get warped by opportunistic extremists. Again, this is a really big topic, and if we had the time, we could get into how immigrants affect rental prices in the short and long term, and the nuances of the Australia tax system. But we still have the UK to cover. We made a whole video breaking down how immigrants affect the United States earlier this year, so viewers who are curious can check that out. Compared to Australia, the UK's own Unite the Kingdom rally on the 13th of September was significantly larger, attracting an estimated 150,000 50,000 people to central London. Unlike the Australian protests, the organisers seemed more relaxed about the use of foreign imagery, as along with the Union Jack and St. George Cross, attendees also carried everything from the Israeli flag to President Trump's own MAGA hats. The rally itself was organised by anti-Islamic activist Tommy Robinson, a co-founder of the English Defence League. Putting Robinson's history aside, the rally he organised clearly resonated with a large portion of the UK population, and attracted big names internationally to speak at the event. This included Alternative for Germany politician Peter Briston, and the leader of the Danish People's Party, Morten Messerschmidt. African-American tech billionaire Elon Musk also made a brief televised appearance where he'd state, quote, "I think there's something beautiful about being British, and what I see happening here is a destruction of Britain. Initially a slow erosion, but rapidly increasing erosion of Britain with massive uncontrolled migration. This is a message to the reasonable centre, the people who ordinarily wouldn't get involved in politics, who just want to live their lives. They don't want that. They're quiet. They just go about their business. My message is to them. If this continues, that violence is going to come to you. You will have no choice." The rally also attracted a relatively modest counter-protest of around 5,000 people, who argued that the views of Tommy Robinson don't represent the majority of the UK. If we look at voting habits, we can see that the current Labour government managed to score a very convincing victory against the Conservative Party last year. With this in mind, current polling currently puts the populist Reform UK as the nation's most popular party, meaning if an election was held tomorrow, they'd be the most likely to win. Although Reform UK has run on an anti-immigration platform, the party has distanced itself from Tommy Robinson, likely owing to his criminal history. The well-organised Unite the Kingdom rally is a stark contrast to the more spontaneous anti-immigration rallies which have taken place across the UK over the past year. Others have included the wave of unrest following the Southport stabbing last year, as well as the anti-immigration protests in Northern Ireland in June this year. In terms of the concerns of the Unite the Kingdom protesters, these proved to be really fucking difficult to research. When it comes to crime, the UK doesn't seem to publish statistics related to immigrant status. This is the same problem we ran into when we tried to look into the same thing in Northern Ireland a few months ago. In terms of cost of living expenses, immigrants don't tend to have much of an effect on general household goods, but can reduce costs by filling labour shortages. Migrants can have an effect on rental costs, with a 1% population increase contributing to a 1% rise in rent. However, this is an issue that tends to disproportionately affect certain areas, and relies on housing supply to keep up with demand. In terms of the cultural impact of migrants, this is the type of eye of the beholder shit we really can't quantify. Rapid cultural changes tend to scare the fuck out of people. But as research demonstrates, assimilation to a nation's culture is inevitable. The bottom line is that we know that immigrants tend to become a long-term benefit for the country they live in. However, large surges can stretch the public infrastructure further than designed. Despite many painting the Unite the Kingdom protesters as radical, the core concern of immigration appears to be shared by a majority of the UK population. According to an Ipsos poll in August this year, nearly half of all British adults have immigration as the #1 most important issue facing the country. The next UK election is scheduled to take place in 2029, so we'll have to wait to see whether the topic of immigration remains a headlining issue. Early this month, the small Himalayan nation of Nepal was suddenly thrust into the spotlight following large-scale protests, dubbed the Gen Z protests because of the large portion of young adults participating. The demonstrations led to the collapse of the Nepalese government and the appointment of Nepal's first female prime minister, elected via Discord call. But first, some background. A significant fraction of Nepal's economy comes in the form of remittances from Nepalese abroad sending money back to family at home. A lack of opportunity in Nepal pushes many young people abroad to find work, and those who stay tend to join online economy work. On the 4th of September, the government of Nepal announced that 26 social media platforms would be blocked in the country, after failing to register with the nation's government. The blocked platforms included Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Notably not blocked was TikTok, who had registered with the government and appointed a local liaison. The blocking of the social media apps severely limited the possibility of finding work for young people within Nepal. Officially, these blocks were to ensure that the platforms could be properly moderated locally within the country, but critics claimed that they were intended to shut down criticism of the government. One such criticism was the Nepo kid trend, which highlighted the privileges and advantages given to the families of influential politicians. The combination of the average Nepali citizen earning under $1,400 per year and seeing the lavish lifestyles of those related to political figures led to significant anger among the young population. Over half of Nepal's population is 25 or younger, so the majority of the nation's population are members of Gen Z, the generation that uses social media the most. Additionally, social media is highly ingrained into everyday life, with on average one account for every 2 people. On the 8th of September, large gatherings occurred in the Nepalese capital of Kathmandu and were initially described as peaceful. However, according to one of the organizers of the protest, the scene turned violent after a rock was thrown at a CCTV camera. The police at the scene responded by firing live ammunition into the crowd, killing 19, including a 12-year-old child, and injuring another 347 people. Following the massacre, protests rapidly grew in scope and ambition. People didn't just want to crack down on corruption, they wanted the whole government to resign. To evade the social media block, protesters extensively utilized VPNs and posted flyers with QR codes for organizing. While there were a number of leadership figures that emerged, there was no clear leadership structure, and the movement was highly decentralized. Curfews were later established in an attempt to quell the unrest. Protests resumed the following day, even larger than before, and Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli ordered his ministers not to resign their posts. He would then heroically resign his post, flee to an army barracks via helicopter, before being moved to an undisclosed location. Other ministers weren't so fortunate. The man on screen being stripped naked and paraded through a river isn't some petty thief. It's the fucking finance minister who was taken from his home after it was set on fire. Other high-ranking officials were seen dangling from a rope while being evacuated via helicopter. Protesters seized on their momentum and stormed several governmental buildings in Kathmandu, setting fire to the Parliament, Supreme Court, a number of administration buildings, as well as the residences of the President and Prime Minister. Several prisons were also attacked by protesters, with at least 2 seeing a 100% breakout rate. In another instance, 5 juvenile inmates were killed while trying to escape a correctional facility in Banke. In the evening of the 10th, the Nepalese army announced that they would take charge of the country in an effort to quell the unrest and violence. The army also requested that the Gen Z protesters meet to discuss the future of the nation. From the evening of that day to early the next morning, the army arrested 27 individuals for arson, looting, and various other no-goodery. The protesters did their best to distance themselves from these individuals, and did not push against the army restoring control over key regions. Separately, over 150,000 protesters met in a large Discord call to debate who they believed should lead the country in the interim. After a few hours of debate and discussion, the protesters decided on former Chief Justice Shushli Akaki as their nomination. On the 10th and the 11th, meetings between the President, Army Generals, and the representatives of Gen Z were conducted to settle on an interim leader. On the 12th, Kaki was confirmed by the Army and Gen Z as the interim Prime Minister, with full elections scheduled for the 5th of March 2026. On the 13th, calm had been restored across the country, and all curfews were lifted. After the dust settled, 72 people, including 60 protesters, 9 prisoners, and 3 police officers, were killed, while another 2,100 had been injured. Kaki officially took office on the 14th of September, pledging to rebuild and get government services back up and running as soon as possible. She condemned the destruction and some of the arson as premeditated, promising to investigate. Finally, she would note that she didn't want to be there, but took the job because that's what people wanted. She then promised not to remain in power for longer than 6 months. News of the protests spread relatively quickly due to the prevalence of social media within the country, most notably through British travel vlogger We Hate the Cold, who managed to Forrest Gump his way through a government being overthrown. In the days since the protests, many government services have been restored, and an aid scheme to rebuild has begun. With elections scheduled in 6 months, hopefully candidates now have time to set up their campaigns and start the process of returning to true normalcy. Without a doubt, we'll be checking back on Nepal when election time rolls around. Viewers who have been paying attention might have noticed that the United States has basically turned into a GTA chaos server. So in the interest of time, we're going to be ripping through US news stories pretty quickly. On the 5th of September, the New York Times published details of a 2019 operation against North Korea. The covert mission involving Navy SEALs had planned to plant a secret listening device within North Korea's borders, which would allow US intelligence to intercept communications from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Citing 24 people who spoke with the Times anonymously, the mission went to shit after one of the mini-subs were discovered offshore. The SEALs would then open fire on the boat, killing all 3 people on board. After boarding, it was found that the 3 people who had just been killed were merely local fishermen, and were not affiliated with the North Korean military. Suspecting that someone probably heard the flurry of gunshots, the SEALs threw the bodies into the sea and immediately aborted the mission. When asked by a reporter, President Trump denied any knowledge of the mission, and some legal experts have questioned the legality of the operation. In all fairness, however, if a nation kills 3 civilians during an operation to spy on the leader of another country, the legal implications are almost irrelevant. The news of the failed operation came just 3 days after another maritime operation this month, which saw the US Navy blow up a narcotics vessel en route from Venezuela to the Caribbean. Speaking at a press conference, the American president would state that the 11 people on board the vessel were members of the Tren de Aragua cartel, and were carrying drugs bound for the United States. Once again, the legality of the operation has also been brought into question. Several legal experts have argued that the strike violated international and maritime law. However, the US has cleverly managed to circumvent these laws by simply never signing them. It should also be noted that back in February, the Trump administration designated the Tren de Aragua cartel as a foreign terrorist organization. This designation has been contentious, however, and Professor Michael Becker of Trinity College Dublin states that the label stretches the meaning of the term beyond its breaking point. Explaining it better than we could, quote, "The fact that US officials describe the individuals killed by the US strike as narco-terrorists does not transform them into lawful military targets. The US is not engaged in an armed conflict with Venezuela or the Tren de Aragua criminal organization. Labeling everyone a terrorist does not make them a lawful target and enables states to sidestep international law." However, nerd legal scholars didn't faze US Vice President J.D. Vance, who posted on Twitter, "Killing cartel members who poison our fellow citizens is the highest and best use of our military." When another user pointed out that this could have been considered a war crime, Vance would then respond, "I don't give a shit what you call it." Ultimately, the Vice President has a point. If the US government says it's okay, then the legality speaks for itself. There were obviously a bunch of comments from the international community, but our favorite came from a spokeswoman from Russia's foreign ministry who said, quote, "What the West has been doing towards states that want to pursue their own independent policies is absolutely inadmissible." This might have carried any weight whatsoever if Russia hadn't just killed 3 children in an aerial strike 3 days earlier in a country they're actively invading. You have to give it to the Russian government, they certainly know how to stir shit. The strikes come amid a buildup of US warships off the coast of Venezuela, which is likely a show of force to other smuggling operations that Uncle Sam really isn't fucking around right now. As of time of writing, the situation hasn't escalated any further. At around the middle of the month, the country had another certified America moment when a political commentator was shot dead in front of 3,000 people. 5% of the country proceeded to treat the victim like they were Nelson Mandela, another 5% seemed to celebrate it like it was the return of the Jedi, and the remaining 90% were too apathetic to give a shit. The nation would then hold its breath over the next few days to find out whether the killer's ideological motives aligned with their opposing political faction. A late-night show host would later say some mild but unfounded shit that would get him suspended after political pressure, then later reinstated after viewer backlash. The whole thing would spark a wide debate around free speech and government overreach. The rest of the world once again looked on in disbelief. The next stop in our American lightning round was President Trump's visit to the United Kingdom, his second official state visit as president. The trip was intended to razzle, dazzle, and flatter the president, with the itinerary less concerned with talks and deal-making, and much more focused on pomp and pageantry. This is likely why the visit was mainly spearheaded by the royal family, who gave the president the largest military ceremonial welcome for a state visit in living memory. Considering Trump seems to decorate his own home like Buckingham Palace, rolling out the royals to butter him up is a pretty wise move. And butter him up they did. On his arrival, the royals called up 120 horses and 1,300 members of the British military to make their point, and even even chauffeured the president in a decked-out carriage to Windsor Castle. During a speech at the royal banquet, King Charles would state that the alliance between the US and UK was the, quote, closest defense, security, and intelligence relationship ever known. He would later go on to say, "Today, as tyranny once again threatens Europe, we and our allies stand together in support of Ukraine to deter aggression and secure peace." This, of course, comes in the context of the UK being one of Ukraine's most vocal supporters, and President Trump taking a more transactional approach to Ukrainian sovereignty. In any case, Mr. Trump's UK visit was highly choreographed, likely because, according to recent polls, most citizens believe that the president's policies have had a negative impact on the UK. Just days before the visit, a campaign group unfurled a 400-meter photo of President Trump with deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Only the next day, a different group would project the same picture on the side of Windsor Castle before being arrested. The day after that, an ad van with the same picture was seized by police in Windsor, with a representative of the organizing group stating, quote, "We're ready to make sure Epstein haunts him everywhere he goes." The series of stunts came just days after the British ambassador to the US was fired following his own ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Whether the UK's red carpet treatment will have a long-lasting effect on the president's policies remains to be seen. September also saw the Department of Homeland Security carry out the largest immigration enforcement operation at a single location. On the 4th of September, a Hyundai manufacturing facility in Elabel, Georgia was raided, leading to the arrest of over 475 people on site. Although some were released shortly after, most were loaded onto buses and taken to the ICE facility in Folkestone, Georgia, more than 100 miles away. The raid itself was later described by some of the workers as a war zone, and there were even reports of workers hiding in air vents and a nearby sewerage pond. ICE claimed that many of the workers were residing in the US illegally or had overstayed their visa. However, the personal records and immigration documentation for those detained hasn't been made public. Homeland Security stated that the raid was the culmination of a months-long investigation. We know at least one of the workers arrested did in fact have a valid visa. However, since we couldn't find a statement by Hyundai disputing the legality of their workers, it's safe to assume that the majority didn't have work authority. Despite the raid's success, much less consideration was taken into the impact of the mass detention effort. Hyundai's $7.6 billion plant is estimated by Georgia's state leaders to create 8,500 jobs in the area. This initial skeleton crew was mostly made up of South Korean workers, who were on site ahead of time because they were the only people on Earth who actually had the expertise to set up the plant. Although roughly 300 Koreans have since been sent home, the South Korean government has been less concerned about their potential visa statuses, and more concerned about how the US government went about enforcing them. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung believed that the raid would make South Korean companies very hesitant to invest in the US, and would state, quote, "This could significantly impact future direct investment in the US." Meanwhile, South Korea's Labor Minister Kim Yong-hoon would comment, "The way it was done, it felt like not even prisoners of war would be treated like that." That was the shock that many of our people felt, and I felt the same way. It's no secret that the Trump administration has been going Super Saiyan 3 in terms of the nation's immigration policy. Just this year, we've covered a wave of deportations to the Salvadorian super prison, 8 immigrants who were deported to South Sudan, and a whole protest movement in LA following a series of ICE raids. The latest move this month had President Trump put a $100,000 fee on H-1B visas. H-1B visas are intended for highly skilled foreign workers who can fill labor shortages in specialized fields, which usually fall within the tech sector. The use of H-1B visas have long been a divisive issue within Trump's own administration. The president's tech allies obviously like the program, as it allows them to draw from a much wider pool of employees. They argue that H-1Bs give the United States an edge when it comes to its lucrative tech sector. The opposing Republican wing argues that the H-1B workers are simply occupying high-paying jobs that could be done by American citizens. A common criticism is that the H-1B program allows tech companies to import workers and subsequently pay them a lower wage, as their immigration status is directly tied to their employment. The Trump administration argues that H-1Bs should be reserved for truly exceptional foreign workers who are paid well enough even by US standards. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick would comment on the change with, quote, "Either the person is very valuable to the company and America, or they are going to depart and the company is going to hire an American. If this strategy sounds familiar at all, you wouldn't be alone. The Trump administration is effectively charging US companies a tax of $100,000 per foreign hire as a protectionist measure for domestic employees. In short, President Trump figured out how to put a tariff on immigrants. Our US section has already gone a bit longer than we'd like, but the UN General Assembly in New York is way too funny not to cover. At the tail end of the month, President Trump showed up to the UN headquarters in New York, and almost immediately, you could tell that he'd run out of fucks to give. In a speech to the heads of state, kings, diplomats, and America's closest allies, he would state that the US is the, quote, hottest country anywhere. The topic of renewable energy would make up around a quarter of his speech, as he would call climate change the greatest con job ever perpetuated on the world, and that the carbon footprint is a hoax made up by people with evil intentions. He would also celebrate his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement before praising clean, beautiful coal. He would then move on to the topic of migrants, stating that Europe needed to end the failed experiment of open borders, before stating, "You have to end it now. I can tell you, I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell." He would then state that he had personally ended 7 wars, go on a digression about he should have gotten the contract to rebuild the UN headquarters, personally insult London's mayor, and make a comment about how his wife was in great shape. At another point, he would criticize NATO countries for buying Russian oil, stating that they were funding the war against themselves. To be fair, we've got to give him that one. The dude has a point. Other highlights of the speech included a claim that environmentalists wanted to kill all the cows, personally thanking the nation of El Salvador for its super prison, and stating that, quote, everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize. At the 57-minute mark of his allotted 15-minute speaking slot, the president walked off like he owned the place, and we at the Swag News team collectively celebrated that our jobs were very, very secure. God bless the United States. We now cross over to the Middle East. On the 9th of September, the Israeli Defense Force would conduct an airstrike within Qatar's capital of Doha, attempting to kill several senior Hamas figures within a residential complex. The attack marked the first time that Israel had conducted a strike within Qatar, a nation which has had a middling but working relationship with Israel over recent years. The attack itself certainly wasn't a successful operation, as not only did the missiles not kill a single senior official, but they ended up killing several civilians and a member of Qatar's armed forces. It should be noted that according to Israeli government sources, the decision to even proceed with the operation was contentious even among the higher-ups within Israel's various military arms. Not only is Qatar a close ally to the United States, which in itself is the closest ally of Israel, but among the targets was Khalil al-Hayya, the Hamas official in charge of the hostage negotiation team. Just 2 days before the strike, Hamas announced that it was ready to immediately start another round of negotiations, following new ideas from the United States regarding a ceasefire agreement. The negotiations were even planned to take place the very day of the attack, which, as you might imagine, didn't end up happening. Reportedly, IDF's Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir, Mossad's Chief David Barnea, and Israel's National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanebi were against the attack. From their perspective, having a real shot at having hostages returned far outweighed the chance of killing a few Hamas officials. They reasoned that even if negotiations didn't work out, they'd still be able to kill the Hamas officials eventually. According to a source speaking to the Washington Post, the reason Israel used an airstrike was because Mossad was unwilling to carry out an operation on the ground, believing the whole thing was a stupid idea. The operation itself wasn't even monitored by Mossad, which is usually the go-to agency for these foreign operations. Reportedly, Israeli leaders in favor of the strike included Israeli Defense Minister, Strategic Affairs Minister, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The catalyst for the strike was supposedly the Ramat Junction shooting the previous day, which killed 6 and injured 21 on a bus to East Jerusalem. The strikes were carried out by a combination of 8 F-15s and 4 F-35s, which fired ballistic missiles into space to avoid violating Saudi Arabia's airspace. As to whether the US knew about the operation, yes, but also no. Reportedly, Israel only tipped off the Americans mere minutes before launching the missiles, and a senior US defense official was quoted as saying, "Notice was given so close to actual launching of missiles that there was no way to reverse or halt the order." Regardless of whether the US thought the strike was a good idea, nearby US Patriot systems did not intercept the missiles on the way to the target. Keep in mind that we absolutely know that these Patriot batteries work, because they were shooting down Iranian missiles only a few months ago. Although the missiles didn't kill any of the intended targets, one of the fatalities was Khalil al-Hayya's son. In a pro-gamer move, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu traded a day of potentially successful peace talks for airstriking the son of the lead negotiator. For what it's worth, all 15 members of the UN Security Council condemn the strike, including the United States. However, in a weird, keeping the pace kind of way, they left any specific reference to Israel outside the statement. Not long after, the UN General Assembly voted to support a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, with 142 nations in favor, 10 against, and 12 choosing to abstain. The 10 votes against are a very strange alliance of countries to say the least, which include the United States, Israel, Argentina, Hungary, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Paraguay, and Tonga. There's probably some deep lore in why half of this list is made up of Pacific Island nations, but it's a big month we have to cover, and we sure as shit wouldn't have time to explain it anyway. The endorsement included some of the harshest criticism of Hamas ever issued by the United Nations, stating that we condemn the attacks perpetuated on 7 October by Hamas against civilians, and Hamas must release all hostages. It also states, quote, "In the context of ending the war in Gaza, Hamas must end its rule in Gaza and hand over its weapons to the Palestinian Authority." Both Israel and the United States were very vocally against the resolution. An Israeli UN ambassador would comment, quote, "This one-sided declaration will not be remembered as a step toward peace, only as another hollow gesture that weakens this assembly's credibility." Meanwhile, a US representative would state that the resolution is yet another misguided and ill-timed publicity stunt that undermines serious diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. They would then comment, "Make no mistake, this resolution is a gift to Hamas." We've recently talked about how Israel's military campaign into Gaza seems to have jaded many of its allies within the United States' sphere of influence. Most recently, the UK, France, Canada, and Australia all formally recognized the state of Palestine at a UN conference in New York this month. It's clear that there seems to be a surprising amount of momentum behind a two-state solution internationally, even within significant portions of both the Israeli government and Hamas's own leadership. With this in mind, based on the strikes in Qatar this month, the hardline Netanyahu government is extremely unlikely to enter into serious negotiations, a stance that will probably hold until at least the nation's legislative election next year. In this month's segment of One Guy's Insecurities Fucking Up Everything, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has now been going for 3 years and 7 months. On the domestic front, Ukraine's commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky told reporters that Russia's spring and summer campaign has effectively been disrupted. Ukraine's colder months usually lead to a more static front line, meaning it's unlikely that Russia will make any major gains after autumn's weather sets in. Drone warfare will, however, continue to evolve, with Russia's latest innovation this month being an incursion into NATO territory. This is what happened on the 9th of September, when an estimated 23 drones crossed over to Poland's eastern border. The nations of Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands were quick to assist in a response, which led to 4 of the drones being shot out of the sky. By the 12th of September, the wrecks of 17 Russian drones had been identified. It's believed that the goal of the operation was to probe NATO's response to a violation of its airspace, as none of the drones were armed, and some were even made of polystyrene. The incursion has marked the first time since Russia's invasion that a NATO country has shot down Russian assets in its airspace. Poland's foreign minister Radoslaw Sikorski would go on to reject a suggestion by US President Donald Trump that the drone wave was a mistake. This was almost immediately reinforced by a second drone incursion into Romania 3 days later, and 3 Russian fighter jets that flew into Estonia's airspace on the 19th of September. What Russia actually gains from from these violations is puzzling to say the least, as September's incidents have only spurred NATO into further building up its own defenses. Poland has already announced that it will be receiving training from Ukraine's anti-drone teams, with Radoslaw Sikorski commenting, quote, "The Ukrainians have better equipment for dealing with Russian drones, and they have much deeper and more up-to-date experience of resisting the Russian army. This is something that the public and the governments in the West need urgently to integrate into their thinking, that it is the Ukrainians who will be training us how to stand up to Russia, not the other way around." This growing list of incidents is likely what led the EU to push forward with its plan to build a €140 billion drone wall, which will shore up its eastern border with Russia. The news comes as the EU looks to construct a deal to give Ukraine a gargantuan €140 billion interest-free loan, paid for by the interest generated by frozen Russian assets. The EU really said, "We're gonna build a drone wall, and Russia's gonna pay for it." Such a loan has long been proposed within the EU. However, the biggest challenge for the European Commission has been using the money in a legally safe manner. EU officials state that the loan is predicated on the assumption that Russia will ultimately be required to pay Ukraine reparations for the enormous damages inflicted during the war. By using interest on frozen Russian assets, the EU can also skirt around the unanimity requirement, as no EU state is actually using their own money for the loan. This is largely to make it easier to deal with Hungary's Kremlin-friendly government, which has a history of vetoing Russian sanctions. Such a loan would represent the single biggest round of aid provided to Ukraine since the start of the war, eclipsing all packages provided by the EU countries combined. As it stands, EU leaders plan to land on an agreement by the end of October. The news might be over, but if you wanted to see more from the team, you might also like our second channel, Surswag Academy.
Trans people make up anywhere from 1.3 to 2.3 million Americans. Though I should clarify, this doesn't include anyone who identifies as non-binary or some other gender.
What up?
Trans people have all... He's rustling
Max,
around.
Shut your non-binary ass up with the crinkling.
Eating chips. I'm trying to listen to the presentation.
I got dough balls. Does anyone want dough balls?
We've also been told that a few of our viewers never got recommended last month's episode, so go ahead and tweak your subscriber settings if you fall into that camp. As we previously mentioned, YouTube doesn't pay us dick or balls when it comes to ad revenue, which is why we'd once again like to thank every single Patreon supporter for keeping the series going. A few hundred people let everyone else watch for free, so we really can't thank them enough. Until next time, on behalf of the entire team, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy month of October.